We succeeded by cutting out the useless employees who held us back, Jason declared from the stage, his voice booming through the conference hall. The crowd erupted in applause as cameras flashed around him. I sat frozen at table 12, watching our biggest launch event transform into my public execution. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 14 years of keeping this company compliant and profitable, I was being branded as dead weight. My name is Denise Holloway, and I'm 52 years old. For over a decade, I had been the chief financial officer at Virepoint Dynamics, a mid-sized manufacturing company based in Portland, Oregon. While others chased headlines and glory, I worked behind the scenes, ensuring our books were clean, our partnerships solid, and our compliance flawless. I wasn't the type to give flashy presentations or schmooze at networking events. I was the woman who made sure the numbers added up and the legal documents were bulletproof. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Jason Wexler, our new CEO, who had swooped in 6 months ago with promises of modernization and growth. From day one, that my methodical approach didn't align with his vision of a dynamic, forward-thinking organization. He wanted yes-men who would rubber stamp his aggressive expansion plans, not someone who asked uncomfortable questions about inflated projections and questionable vendor agreements. As I watched Jason bask in the spotlight, describing our latest product line as revolutionary, I couldn't help but think about the unsigned audit report sitting in my office safe, the one that detailed discrepancies I had discovered just last week, the one I had refused to certify until we addressed the irregularities. Jason had brushed off my concerns, insisting we could clean up the details later, but I knew better. I had spent my entire career building a reputation for integrity, and I wasn't about to compromise it. Now, the audience hung on Jason's every word as he painted a picture of unprecedented success and limitless potential. Investors nodded approvingly, their checkbooks practically visible in their eyes. I noticed several board members scattered throughout the crowd, all wearing satisfied smiles. They had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. Security guards began moving through the crowd, their destination obvious. I had expected this moment ever since Jason called me into his office that morning and delivered the news, with his characteristic smirk. "Your services are no longer required, Denise. We're going in a different direction." He had timed my termination perfectly, right before our biggest event, ensuring maximum humiliation. But as the guards approached my table, I stood up calmly and reached for the black folder I had prepared. Something told me this evening wasn't going to unfold exactly as Jason had planned. Looking back, I should have seen the writing on the wall months earlier. Jason had arrived at Virepoint Dynamics with great fanfare, recruited by our board after our previous CEO announced his retirement. The industry publications had heralded him as a visionary leader who had transformed his previous company from a regional player into a national powerhouse. What they failed to mention was that he had left that company just before a federal investigation into accounting irregularities. I had done my research, of course. It was my job to be thorough. When I brought my concerns to the board, they dismissed them as typical resistance to change. "Jason brings exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," Board Chairman Robert Hayes had told me during our quarterly meeting. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results." Those calculated risks had started almost immediately. Jason began pushing for aggressive revenue targets that seemed divorced from reality. He wanted to expand into new markets without proper research, sign contracts with vendors I had never properly vetted, and pursue partnerships that made my compliance instincts scream. Every time I raised questions, he would smile that condescending smile and tell me I was being unnecessarily cautious. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago during our monthly executive meeting. Jason had presented a proposal to backdate several vendor agreements to inflate our quarterly numbers. The room had gone silent as he outlined his plan, all eyes eventually turning to me. I had looked him straight in the eye and said, "I cannot, and will not sign off on any documentation that misrepresents our financial position." His mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath his charming exterior. "Denise, I understand your concerns, but we need to think creatively about our reporting. This is standard practice in the industry." "No, Jason, it isn't," I had replied firmly. "And even if it were, it would still be fraud." The tension in the room had been palpable. Other executives had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly torn between supporting their new CEO and backing the woman who had kept the company out of legal trouble for over a decade. In the end, most had remained silent, which told me everything I needed to know about where their loyalties lay. That night, I had gone home and begun documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every inappropriate request, every corner Jason had tried to get me to cut. I had photographed emails, copied files, and created a comprehensive record of his attempts to manipulate our financial reporting. Call it professional paranoia or simply sense, but I had learned long ago that when integrity was at stake, documentation was your best defense. My assistant, Catherine, had noticed my late nights and weekend work sessions. "Is everything okay, Denise?" As I locked yet another set of files in my office safe last Friday, she had asked, "I'm just being extra careful," which was both true and an understatement. Catherine had worked for the company for 8 years, and she knew me well enough to know when something was seriously wrong. The revelation that would change everything came the week before the launch event, concealed in a routine audit report that should have been simple. I spent the entire weekend in my office cross-referencing documents and following paper trails after noticing discrepancies in several key accounts. Revenue numbers that didn't match our actual sales records, expenses that had been mysteriously reclassified, and vendor payments that corresponded to contracts I had never seen. Jason had not only been pushing aggressive accounting practices, but he had also been actively falsifying records. Our cash flow statements had been doctored. Expenses had been manipulated to give the impression of improved margins, and revenue had been inflated by nearly 15% through a combination of backdated contracts and fictitious sales. The audit firm we had been working with for years, McKenna and Associates, had already started their preliminary review. "Denise, these numbers don't match what we've been provided," he said after I went over my findings with their senior partner, David McKenna, whom I knew personally and trusted for his integrity. "If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at systematic fraud." "That's what we're looking at," I said. "The question is, what do we do about it?" David remained silent for a while before saying, "We must stop the audit right away until these differences are fixed. Financial statements that I know to be dishonest cannot be approved by me." When I brought a copy of the preliminary audit findings and documentation of the irregularities to Jason's office on Monday morning, I asked for an urgent meeting. I was surprised by his response, which was not one of denial or even anger, but rather of smiling and leaning back in his chair. "Denise, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. All of these are really variations on the same information. Technically, nothing we're doing is against the law." I put the papers on Jason's desk and stated, "This is fraud. We can't show the board or investors these figures." His smile never faltered as he said, Then maybe it's time we talked about your future with this company. The threat was obvious, but I refused to back down. Are you asking me to certify phony financial statements? As I prepared for what I knew would be my last week at Verentoint Dynamics, I made sure that every piece of evidence was meticulously preserved and organized. If Jason wanted to play hardball, I would be ready. I'm asking you to be a team player. I got up and collected my documents. Then I guess we have a problem. That conversation had sealed my fate, but it had also solidified my resolve. Jason could humiliate me or even ruin my reputation, but he could not force me to compromise my integrity. It was the kind of high-profile event where Jason thrived, and the evening of the launch event arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Jason had imagined. The ballroom at the Everhart Hotel was decked out in Verentoint's corporate colors. Servers passed around expensive wine and catered appetizers. Industry journalists mixed with board members, key clients, and potential investors. And I arrived fashionably late, wearing my best black suit and carrying the folder that would change everything. Catherine had offered to accompany me for moral support, but I had turned her down because I needed to do this on my own. The presentation started at precisely 7 p.m. Jason took the stage with practiced confidence, his smile bright enough to power the entire hotel, and he spoke passionately about innovation, market disruption, and Verentoint's bright future. The audience was captivated, hanging on his every word as he painted a picture of unprecedented growth and profitability. As I entered the ballroom, I saw Jason near the stage, surrounded by admirers, and holding court like the consummate showman he was. Board Chairman Robert Hayes smiled from his front row seat, obviously pleased with his choice of CEO. Our third quarter results exceeded all expectations, he said, pointing to the large screen showing our supposedly stellar financial performance. Revenue is up 18% year over year, and our profit margins have improved significantly thanks to strategic operational improvements. I felt my stomach tighten as I watched him present the fraudulent numbers with such conviction. Several investors in the audience were nodding approvingly, clearly impressed by what they perceived as outstanding financial health. We're not just growing, Jason declared. We're revolutionizing how this industry thinks about efficiency and profitability. Then came the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Jason went on to outline ambitious expansion plans and projected growth targets that were entirely based on the false financial foundation he had constructed. Success requires difficult decisions, Jason said, his voice becoming more solemn, as he readied himself to discuss what he described as necessary organizational changes. To achieve the results you see today, we had to eliminate inefficiencies and remove obstacles to progress. Sometimes that means parting ways with employees who are resistant to change or unable to adapt to new methodologies. We succeeded by cutting out the useless employees who held us back, Jason said with renewed energy, his smile returning, and the audience listened intently, obviously buying into his story of difficult but necessary leadership decisions. I could see several investors nodding and understanding, accepting the premise that successful companies sometimes had to make difficult personnel decisions. Jason had planned this moment flawlessly, public humiliation followed by physical removal, all in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to our industry. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause, and I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Some attendees knew exactly who he was referring to, and I could feel their gazes burning into me. Security guards started moving through the crowd, their destination unmistakably my table. It was a masterclass in character assassination. But when the guards came, I got up quietly and started to move toward the stage, and the audience fell silent, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Jason's smile wavered a little when he saw me move, but he quickly recovered, presumably thinking I was going to make some sort of emotional outburst or a desperate plea. I climbed the steps to the stage with measured composure, holding my black folder tightly in my hands. "Congratulations on your success," I said clearly, my voice echoing throughout the silent room, my tone perfectly cordial, even warm, which seemed to catch Jason off guard. The ballroom had gone completely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on the drama that was playing out. Jason remained confident, reaching out to shake my hand as if to say, "Goodbye," but I gave him the folder instead. I turned and left the stage without saying another word, and I heard the mutter of bewildered voices behind me as Jason opened the folder that would destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. 14 pages of meticulously documented evidence that would dismantle Jason's carefully crafted web of deceit. Driving home through the streets of Portland, I pictured him opening that black cover and seeing the first page, a cover letter from McKenna and Associates stating that they would not certify our financial statements until major irregularities in reported revenue and expense allocations were resolved. The second section included printouts of the original sales records alongside the doctored versions Jason had submitted for the quarterly reports. Side-by-side comparisons that made the inflation impossible to deny. Revenue that had been artificially boosted through backdated contracts with vendors who had written confirmation that they had never agreed to the terms being reported. Page 7 detailed the expense reclassifications that had been used to improve our apparent profit margins. Legitimate operational that had been moved to different categories or written off entirely to create the illusion of efficiency improvements. Every manipulation was highlighted and cross-referenced with the original documentation. The most damaging section came toward the end. Email printouts of Jason's own words, demanding that accounting staff find creative solutions to revenue shortfalls and instructing department heads to think outside the box when it came to expense reporting. His digital trail of pressure and intimidation was preserved in black and white. The final pages contained statements from 3 key vendors who had been contacted by Jason's team about backdating agreements. All 3 had refused and provided written documentation of those requests. One had even indicated that they were considering ending their relationship with Virepoint due to what they perceived as unethical business practices. My phone was ringing by the time I got to my suburban home, and I let Catherine's number go to voicemail, then Robert Hayes's, then 2 board members I knew, and each one went unanswered as I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, finally letting myself feel the full impact of what had just happened. The evening news was already airing a story about disruption at a major Portland manufacturing company's launch event. And although they had no specifics, they said that high-profile investors had abruptly left after an unexpected interruption to the proceedings, and that sources at the scene described what seemed to be a significant document exchange that caused obvious distress among attendees. David McKenna texted me, buzzing my phone, saying, "I saw the news. Are you all right?" When Catherine tried to call again, I answered and said, "Yes, the correct thing was done." "Denise, what happened?" "After you left, everything went nuts. Investors began to depart in groups after Jason appeared to have seen a ghost." "Is everything all right?" Jason was finally able to view the true financial situation rather than the fiction he had been presenting. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I told her. "What are you saying?" "You'll probably want to start looking for another position," Catherine said. Catherine was astute enough to read between the lines, and she said, Denise, what was in that folder? There was silence on the other end as she processed what I was telling her. Virepoint is going to face some serious challenges in the coming weeks. I said plainly, the truth? Just the truth. The applause that had greeted his announcement that he was laying off useless employees would be the last celebration Jason would have at Virepoint Dynamics, and I gave myself a moment of satisfaction after hanging up. I had watched Jason manipulate numbers, pressure employees, and build his success on a foundation of lies for months, and tonight that foundation had crumbled in front of the very people he had been trying to impress. By 10 a.m., 3 major investors had formally requested emergency meetings with the board of directors, and 2 others had sent letters indicating their intention to reevaluate their investment position pending clarification of recent financial disclosures. The first wave of consequences began Wednesday morning, when I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The Portland Business Journal. I had somehow obtained details about the launch event and published an article titled Financial Questions Rock Virepoint Dynamics Following Executive Departure. Although they were careful to avoid specific accusations, the implication was clear. Something big had gone wrong. Just before noon, Catherine called and said in a tense, anxious voice, "Denise, there's chaos in the office." Jason looked awful, yet he called an all-hands meeting this morning. He said that everything was in control, but no one took him seriously. David McKenna and 2 additional auditors arrived, and they spent hours trapped in the conference room with Jason and Robert Hayes. "How is employee morale?" Sincerely worried about my former coworkers, I inquired. "People are afraid. There have been rumors of layoffs and financial difficulties at the company. Some claim that you were correct to suspect Jason of falsifying the books all along. I had worked with these people for years, professionals who deserved better than to have their careers ruined by one man's ambition and greed, and the validation felt hollow. Being proven correct about Jason's corruption brought no joy when it meant possible hardship for innocent employees who had just been trying to do their jobs." Through a press release citing ongoing financial review processes and the need for complete transparency during the evaluation period, the board announced on Thursday that Jason had been placed on administrative leave pending a thorough audit. It was evident from reading between the lines that the board was preparing to sever all ties with Jason. I had known Marcus Wright, the CEO of Bridge Manufacturing, one of Virepoint's main rivals, professionally for years through industry events, and I appreciated his reputation for moral leadership, so I was surprised when he called me on Friday afternoon. "Denise, I heard about the situation at Virepoint," he began without any explanation. "I also heard that you were the one who exposed whatever was going on over there." The phrase, "word travels fast in our industry," I cautiously answered. "When someone exhibits true courage, it does. Listen, I want to talk to you about an opportunity, even though I know now is probably not the greatest time. We are seeking someone with unwavering integrity and extensive industry experience to lead our financial operations." The offer caught me off guard. In my focus on doing the right thing at Virepoint, I hadn't given much thought to what would come next for my career. The idea of joining a competitor, especially one with Bridge's stellar reputation, was intriguing. "I appreciate the interest, Marcus, but I should probably let things settle down before making any major decisions. Of course, Denise, what you did took real guts. The whole industry is talking about it. There are people who respect what you stood up for." After hanging up, I realized that my professional reputation, which I had worried might be damaged by the confrontation with Jason, was actually being enhanced. The industry was recognizing my actions not as corporate disloyalty, but as professional integrity. Other executives were seeing what happened at Verpoint as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical leadership. The following week would bring even more dramatic developments, but for now, I allowed myself to feel cautiously optimistic about both the immediate consequences of my actions and the longer-term possibilities for my career. Exactly 1 week after the launch event, Catherine called with the news that would permanently ruin Jason's career while I was enjoying coffee at my kitchen table. It was the last blow, delivered with the icy precision of a federal probe. "Denise, the FBI is here," she said softly over the phone, "and they came with warrants about an hour ago. Everything is being seized, including computers and information." Even I was surprised by how quickly the investigation moved. It turns out that one of the investors who had left the launch event had contacts at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the folder I had given Jason had not only exposed him to our board and investors, but it had also sparked a federal investigation into securities fraud. Jason was arrested at his home this morning. "How about the employees?" I inquired, putting my worry for my former co-workers ahead of any joy I might have had over Jason's detention. "While they finish the seizure, the majority of individuals are being sent home. Human Resources is telling everyone that the company will continue operating, but honestly, nobody knows what's going to happen." The afternoon news confirmed Jason had been charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate financial records. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. Verpoint stock, which had been trading at record highs just days earlier, had been suspended pending the investigation. By evening, the story had reached the national business news. CNBC ran a segment about corporate fraud in mid-sized manufacturing companies, using Verpoint as a case study in how quickly fraudulent accounting practices could unravel. The reporter noted that the investigation had been triggered by whistleblower, evidence provided by a former executive with intimate knowledge of the company's financial practices. Robert Hayes resigned from the board that same day, along with 2 other directors who had been instrumental in hiring Jason. The remaining board members appointed an interim CEO and announced their intention to cooperate fully with federal authorities. Investigators also issued a public statement acknowledging that serious financial irregularities had been discovered and promising full transparency throughout the investigation. The irony was not lost on me. Jason had branded me as a useless employee who held the company back. In reality, I had been the only thing standing between Verpoint and complete destruction. My refusal to certify fraudulent financial statements hadn't just protected integrity, it had saved the company from even deeper legal troubles. The transition had gone remarkably smoothly, and 3 months later I was sitting in the executive conference room at Brightage Manufacturing, reviewing quarterly reports as their new chief financial officer. Marcus Wright had extended his offer after the dust settled at Verpoint, and I had accepted, drawn by his dedication to moral leadership and open operations. Brightridge's financial systems were what I had hoped to find: meticulously maintained, fully compliant, and refreshingly simple. After years of battling Jason's attempts to manipulate our numbers, working with QuickBooks felt like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. Industry analysts estimated that his fraud had cost investors over $12 million in inflated valuations and false projections. Several civil lawsuits had been filed by pension funds and individual investors who had made decisions based on the fraudulent financial statements. The interim CEO had managed to stabilize the company by enacting aggressive cost-cutting measures and completely overhauling their financial reporting systems. They had also hired McKenna and Associates to conduct a comprehensive audit and implement new oversight procedures. And Catherine had remained as part of the skeleton crew working to rebuild the company's operations and reputation. As I looked over Bright Ridge's impeccable financial records, I thought about how much my life had changed since that night at the Everhart Hotel. Sometimes doing the right thing came with a cost, but sometimes it led to opportunities better than you could have imagined. I had been asked to speak at 3 conferences about corporate governance and ethical leadership, but I had turned down every invitation because I wanted to let my actions speak for themselves. David McKenna texted me. I saw the Bright Ridge announcement, and my phone buzzed. Congrats on your new role. The industry is fortunate to have someone with your integrity in a leadership position. Reflecting on the journey that led me here, I felt a sense of quiet fulfillment knowing that, on occasion, justice and career success may coexist harmoniously.